In September of 1995, an American anthropologist named Johann Reinhard and his Peruvian climbing partner Miguel Zarate were descending from the summit of Mount Ampato, a 20,000-foot volcanic peak in southern Peru, when they spotted something impossible lying on the frozen scree. It was a bundle of textiles, brightly colored and unmistakably ancient, exposed by the recent retreat of the mountain's ice cap. As they moved closer, the scale of what they were seeing came into focus. This was not just cloth. Wrapped within those textiles was the frozen, nearly perfect body of a young girl, perhaps 13 or 14 years old at the time of her death, preserved for more than 5 centuries in the high-altitude cold. Her skin, her hair, her internal organs, even the contents of her stomach remained intact. She had been dressed in fine garments and surrounded by offerings of gold, silver, pottery, and textiles. She had been placed there deliberately, at the very summit of one of the highest peaks in the Andes, as part of a ritual called capacocha, a practice of child sacrifice carried out by the Inca Empire at the height of its power. The girl, who would later be known as Juanita, or the Ice Maiden, became one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the late 20th century, not because her death was unique, but because her preservation was. Her body held within it a record that could be read by modern science, a record written in isotopes and DNA, in the chemistry of her bones and the strands of her hair, that would reveal not just how she died, but where she came from, how far she traveled, and what kind of empire commanded the resources and the authority to bring a girl from a distant province all the way to the sacred summit of a mountain, to be left there as an offering to the gods. This is the story of the Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, the land of the Four Quarters, the largest pre-Columbian empire in the Americas, a political and military power that stretched nearly 3,000 miles along the spine of the Andes and encompassed a population estimated, depending on which historical reconstruction you trust, at somewhere between 6 and 14 million people at the time of Spanish contact. It is a story that has been told many times, in many ways, often through the lens of colonial chronicles written by Spanish priests and soldiers who arrived after the empire's collapse, or through the romanticized narratives of lost civilizations that have dominated popular imagination for more than a century. But it is also a story that is being rewritten today, piece by piece, by the tools of modern science, by the analysis of ancient DNA extracted from mummies and skeletal remains, by the isotopic signatures locked in bone and tooth enamel that trace the movement of individuals across landscapes, by the linguistic maps that show us not a single Inca people, but a patchwork of languages and identities held together by a political system that was as pragmatic as it was ambitious. What genetics reveals about the Inca Empire is not a story of ethnic purity or a single chosen bloodline descending from the sun, as the Inca rulers themselves claimed in their origin myths. It is a story of diversity, of conquest and incorporation, of dozens of distinct groups, each with their own genetic heritage and their own languages, brought together under a single administrative system in less than a century of explosive expansion. It is the story of how an empire can be built not on shared ancestry, but on shared roads, shared labor obligations, and a shared cosmology enforced from the capital city of Cusco. And it is the story of how that empire, despite its size and its sophistication, collapsed with a speed that still shocks historians, brought down by a combination of internal civil war, epidemic disease, and the arrival of a tiny force of Spanish conquistadors who understood, better than anyone, how to exploit the fractures in a system that had grown too fast and too far. To understand what genetics can tell us about the Inca Empire, we first have to understand the empire itself, the sheer improbable scale of what was built in such a short time. The timeline matters here, because when we talk about the Inca Empire, we are not talking about a civilization that developed slowly over millennia, like the Maya or the societies of the Mississippi River Valley. We are talking about a political entity that exploded outward from a single city-state, Cusco, in the span of less than 100 years. The traditional date given for the beginning of Inca imperial expansion is around 1438, during the reign of the 9th Sapa Inca, the Emperor Pachacuti, whose name means earth-shaker, or he who overturns the world, and who is credited in both Inca oral tradition and in the Spanish chronicles, with transforming Cusco from a regional power into the core of an empire. Before Pachacuti, the Incas were one polity among many in the highlands of what is now southern Peru, competing with neighboring groups like the Chanca and the Colla for control of agricultural land and trade routes. After Pachacuti, within the span of a single long reign, the Inca armies had pushed outward in all directions, conquering or coercing the submission of the kingdoms and chiefdoms that surrounded them, incorporating their populations into a tribute system, resettling entire communities to break up regional power bases, and building the infrastructure that would allow the empire to grow even further under his successors. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1532, the empire stretched from the modern border between Colombia and Ecuador in the north, all the way south through the highlands and coastal valleys Peru and Bolivia, into northwest Argentina and central Chile. The northern frontier was marked by the Ancasmayo River in what is now southern Colombia. The southern frontier reached beyond modern-day Santiago, Chile, though resistance from the Mapuche people prevented further expansion into the southern forests. The empire controlled not just the high Andes, but also the dry coastal deserts, the eastern slopes descending into the Amazon basin, and the high-altitude grasslands of the Altiplano. It was a geographic and ecological patchwork, held together by a road network that remains one of the engineering marvels of the pre-modern world. That road network, the Chapac-Ñan, the Great Inca Road, is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most tangible pieces of evidence we have for the administrative capacity and the ambition of the Inca state. Modern surveys and archaeological mapping have documented more than 40,000 kilometers of roads, some of them paved, some of them carved directly into cliffsides, others marked only by lines of stones across the desert. There were two main north-south arteries, one running along the coast and one through the highlands, connected by lateral roads that crossed the mountain passes. Along these roads were way stations, tambos, spaced at intervals of a day's walk, where imperial officials, armies, and the relay runners called chasquis could rest and resupply. The chasqui carried messages encoded in knotted strings called quipus, the closest thing the Inca Empire had to a writing system, and they could cover enormous distances in a matter of days, carrying information from the frontiers back to Cusco and carrying orders from Cusco outward to provincial governors. The roads were also the arteries through which the empire moved people. The Inca state practiced a policy called mitma, the forced resettlement of populations, both as a way to break up potential resistance in newly conquered regions and as a way to spread Quechua-speaking colonists into areas where other languages dominated. Entire communities could be uprooted and moved hundreds of miles, their labor obligations redirected, their children raised speaking Quechua alongside or instead of their ancestral tongues. This was not an empire that relied primarily on garrisons and soldiers to maintain control. It was an empire that relied on infrastructure, on the movement of goods and people, on the ritual obligations that tied provincial elites to the center, and on the carefully managed flow of information through a system that had no paper, no alphabet, no written records as we would recognize them. And yet it worked. It worked so well that within a few generations, the Inca state had incorporated millions of people, reorganized entire regional economies around the production and storage of maize and potatoes and dried meat and textiles, and had created a political identity, an idea of Tawantinsuyu, the four parts, that could be imposed over the older ethnic and linguistic identities that predated it. But here is where the genetics starts to matter, because when we talk about the Inca Empire, the question that comes up again and again in popular histories and even in some older academic work is this: who were the Incas? Were they a single ethnic group, a people with a shared origin, who conquered and absorbed everyone else? Was there such a thing as Inca DNA, a genetic signature that you could trace from the royal families of Cusco outward through the empire, marking the spread of a dominant population? The answer, according to every genetic study that has been done on ancient and modern Andean populations, is no. There was no single Inca ethnicity in a genetic sense. The people we call the Incas, the ruling families of Cusco who claimed descent from the sun god Inti and who held the exclusive right to wear the royal fringe, the mascapaicha, were speakers of Quechua, one of several major language families in the Andes, but they were not genetically distinct from the other highland populations around them. What made someone Inca was not their DNA. It was their membership in one of the royal Ayllus, the kinship groups that claimed descent from past emperors, and their participation in the political and religious institutions centered in Cusco. The empire that these families built was fundamentally multiethnic, a patchwork of conquered and allied groups, each of which retained, to varying degrees, their own languages, their own local gods, their own styles of pottery and textiles and architecture. The genetic diversity of the Inca Empire reflected the diversity of the Andes itself, a landscape where geography creates natural boundaries, where valleys separated by a single mountain range can develop distinct cultural and linguistic traditions over centuries, and where the population history stretches back not 100 years, but more than 10,000, to the earliest human migrations into South America at the end of the last ice age. When we look at the genetic data from modern Andean populations, what we see is a pattern that confirms this. The indigenous peoples of the Andes today, including those who identify as Quechua or Aymara, the two largest ethno-linguistic groups in the region, show considerable genetic structure, meaning that different populations carry distinct genetic signatures that reflect their regional origins and their histories of relative isolation or admixture. Studies that have sampled populations from across Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador have found that genetic variation in the Andes is geographically patterned. People from the northern highlands are genetically distinguishable from people from the southern highlands, and both are distinguishable from coastal populations. This structure did not arise in the 100 years of Inca rule. It reflects deeper histories, migrations, and population splits that happened long before the Incas emerged as a political force. What the Inca Empire did was overlay a political and linguistic unity onto this genetic diversity. It spread the Quechua language, which became the administrative lingua franca of the empire, even in regions where most people continued to speak Aymara or Puquina or Mochica or any of the dozens of other languages that existed at the time. It created a shared material culture, a standardized style of pottery and textiles that archaeologists call Inca Imperial, which was produced and distributed throughout the empire, often in state-run workshops. It built temples and administrative centers in a recognizable architectural style, with finely fitted stone masonry that required no mortar, a technique that was as much a symbol of state power as it was an engineering solution. But it did not erase the underlying diversity. It did not, in most cases, even try to. The Inca system of governance was based on indirect rule. Local elites, the carachas, were left in place as long as they accepted Inca overlordship, provided tribute in the form of labor and goods, and sent their children to Cusco to be educated in the ways of the empire and, implicitly, to serve as hostages, ensuring their parents' loyalty. What the Inca state wanted was not ethnic homogeneity. It wanted control, tribute, and the labor power to build roads, terraces, storehouses, and armies. Genetics shows us that the empire succeeded in creating a political unity without erasing the genetic or, in many cases, the cultural diversity of the populations it ruled. Now let us return to Juanita, the Ice Maiden of Mount Ampato, because her body and the bodies of other children sacrificed in the capacocha rituals provide some of the most direct genetic and isotopic evidence we have about how the Inca Empire actually functioned at the level of individual lives. Capacocha was not a frequent ritual. It was reserved for moments of great importance to the state: the death or accession of an emperor, a military victory, a natural disaster that required appeasement of the gods. Children, usually between the ages of 6 and 15, were selected from provinces across the empire, chosen for their physical perfection and often for their status as children of local elites. They were brought to Cusco, where they participated in ceremonies at the center of the empire, and then they were taken, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually, to the summits of sacred mountains, where they were dressed in fine textiles, given offerings of food and chicha, maize beer, and sometimes coca leaves, and left to die of exposure in the cold. It was understood, both by the Inca state and by the families of the children, as the highest honor, a transformation of the child into a sacred being, a permanent intermediary between the human world and the divine. The children were not killed violently. In most cases, the evidence suggests they were given alcohol or coca to sedate them, and then left on the mountain to succumb to hypothermia. Their bodies were placed in stone platforms or buried in shallow pits, surrounded by offerings, and the altitude and the cold preserved them in a way that would have been impossible at lower elevations. More than a dozen of these capacocha burials have been found over the past few decades, scattered across the highest peaks of the Andes in Peru, Argentina, and Chile. The most famous, besides Juanita, are the 3 children found on Mount Lulailaco, a 22,000-foot peak on the Argentina-Chile border, in 1999. A girl of about 15, a boy of about 7, and a girl of about 6, all preserved with extraordinary completeness. Their skin, their hair, their clothing, their internal organs all intact. What makes these burials so valuable to science is that the preservation is so complete that we can extract not just DNA, but also isotopic data from their hair, their teeth, their bones, data that allows us to reconstruct, month by month in some cases, where these children lived and what they ate in the years and months before their deaths. Isotopes are variants of chemical elements that have different numbers of neutrons in their nuclei, and they behave slightly differently in biological and geological processes. The isotopes of elements like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium are incorporated into the body from food and water, and the ratios of these isotopes vary depending on where you are, what you eat, and in some cases, what altitude you live at. Strontium isotopes, for example, vary depending on the geology of the local bedrock, and they are absorbed into the body through drinking water and plant foods. When a person grows up in one region and then moves to another, the strontium signature in their bones and teeth, which form during childhood, will reflect their place of origin, while the strontium in their hair, which grows continuously, will reflect more recent locations. Oxygen isotopes in drinking water vary with altitude and latitude, and they too are incorporated into the body, providing another geographic marker. By analyzing these isotopes in the hair and teeth of capacocha victims, researchers have been able to show that many of these children were not from Cusco. They were brought from distant provinces, sometimes from hundreds of miles away, in the months before their deaths. Their hair shows changes in diet and in isotopic signatures that correspond to the journey from their home region to Cusco, and then from Cusco to the mountain summit. Juanita, the Ice Maiden from Mount Ampato, appears to have grown up in a region with a different isotopic signature from the Cusco area, probably somewhere in the southern highlands or along the coast, and she was moved to the capital before being taken to the mountain. The Lulailaco children show similar patterns. The oldest girl, known as the Lulailaco Maiden, has hair that shows a dramatic shift in diet about a year before her death, with a marked increase in the consumption of maize and animal protein, foods associated with elite status and with ritual participation in Cusco. Genetic analysis of these children is more limited, because DNA degrades even in frozen tissue. But where it has been possible to extract mitochondrial DNA, the results show that the children carried haplogroups common in the Andean region, haplogroups like A2, B2, C1, and D1, which are found throughout indigenous populations in South America and which trace back to the initial peopling of the continent more than 15,000 years ago. These haplogroups are not specific to the Incas. They are pan-Andean, found in Quechua speakers and Aymara speakers, and the descendants of coastal peoples like the Moche and the Chimu. What the genetics confirms, in other words, is that the children selected for capacocha came from the general indigenous population of the empire, not from a genetically distinct Inca ruling class. They were chosen for ritual reasons, for their perceived perfection, and for the political value of incorporating local elites into the state cult. But they were not genetically different from the populations around them. This brings us to a broader point about what ancient DNA can and cannot tell us about the Inca Empire. We do not have, and we likely will never have, a large sample of DNA from individuals who can be definitively identified as members of the royal Inca lineages, the Panacas that claimed descent from past emperors. The Spanish systematically dismantled the Inca nobility after the conquest, and while some descendants of the royal families survived and maintained their status into the colonial period, their remains have not been identified or studied genetically in any systematic way. The mummies of the Inca emperors themselves, which were kept in Cusco and paraded through the streets during festivals, were seized and destroyed by the Spanish in the late 16th century as part of the effort to eradicate what the church saw as idolatry. What we do have is DNA from a range of individuals who lived under Inca rule, and from modern populations who are the descendants of the people who lived in Tawantinsuyu. And what that DNA shows is continuity. The genetic structure of modern Andean populations, the patterns of regional variation, the distribution of mitochondrial and Y chromosome haplogroups, all of this looks very much like what we would expect if the Inca Empire had functioned the way the ethno-historic sources describe it, as a multi-ethnic political system that incorporated diverse populations without replacing them. There was no large-scale genetic replacement during the Inca period. There was no wave of Cusco origin settlers who genetically swamped the provinces. What there was, instead, was a system of political and cultural integration that operated at a different level, through language, through labor obligations, through the ritual and administrative ties that bound provincial elites to the imperial center. When geneticists compare modern Quechua-speaking populations from different regions of the Andes, they find genetic differences that correlate with geography, not with language. In other words, speaking Quechua does not make you genetically similar to other Quechua speakers from distant regions. It makes you part of a cultural and linguistic community that was spread by the Inca Empire, but it does not erase your deeper genetic ties to your region of origin. The same is true for Aymara speakers, who are genetically continuous with the populations of the Titicaca Basin and the southern Altiplano, the region where the Aymara language has been spoken for at least 1,000 years, predating the Inca conquest of that region by centuries. The multi-ethnic nature of the Inca Empire is also visible in the archaeological record, in ways that complement the genetic data. When archaeologists excavate Inca provincial centers, they find evidence of local styles of pottery and architecture existing alongside the standardized Inca imperial style. They find burials that follow local customs, not the customs of Cusco. They find evidence of local languages being spoken and local deities being worshipped, even as the state cult of the sun god Inti was imposed from above. One of the most striking examples of this comes from the north coast of Peru, where the Inca conquest in the 1470s brought an end to the Chimor kingdom, a powerful state centered on the city of Chan Chan, which had controlled the coastal valleys for more than 2 centuries. The Chimor spoke a language called Mochica, unrelated to Quechua, and they had their own sophisticated traditions of metallurgy, textile production, and hydraulic engineering. When the Incas conquered Chimor, they did not destroy Chan Chan. They incorporated it. They brought Chimor artisans to Cusco to work in state workshops. They married Chimor noblewomen into the Inca royal lineages. They built Inca-style administrative centers in the Chimor heartland, but they left much of the local infrastructure and the local elite structure intact. The genetic legacy of this is still visible today in the coastal populations of northern Peru, who show genetic continuity with earlier coastal populations and who are genetically distinguishable from highland Quechua speakers, even though many coastal people today speak Spanish and have for generations, and the indigenous languages of the coast have mostly disappeared. The point is that the Inca Empire was not built on the idea of turning everyone into Incas in an ethnic sense. It was built on the idea of creating a political and economic system that could extract tribute and labor from a diverse population while allowing, and in some cases even encouraging, the persistence of local identities, as long as those identities did not threaten the stability of the state. And then, with a speed that still seems almost impossible, the entire system collapsed. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire is one of the most analyzed events in the history of European colonialism, and it remains one of the most debated. How did a force of fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers, led by an illiterate pig farmer from Extremadura named Francisco Pizarro, manage to topple an empire of millions in the span of a few years? The traditional narrative, the one that dominated for centuries, emphasized Spanish technological superiority, horses and steel swords and guns, and the supposed divine favor that the Spanish believed they carried with them. More recent scholarship has complicated this narrative considerably, showing that the Spanish were not, in fact, technologically invincible, that Inca weapons and tactics were effective in many engagements, and that the real advantage the Spanish had was not military but political and biological. The political advantage was that they arrived at exactly the moment when the Inca Empire was tearing itself apart in a civil war. The biological advantage was that they, or rather the diseases they carried with them, had already done much of the work of destabilization before Pizarro ever set foot in Tawantinsuyu. The civil war that weakened the empire at the moment of Spanish arrival was a war of succession fought between two sons of the Emperor Huayna Capac, who had ruled at the height of Inca power in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Huayna Capac had extended the empire to its greatest extent, pushing the northern frontier into what is now Ecuador and spending much of his reign campaigning in the north, far from Cusco. Sometime around 1527, while he was in the northern city of Quito, Huayna Capac died suddenly, along with his designated heir, the Crown Prince Ninan Cuyuchi, and within a matter of months, tens of thousands of people across the empire also died in what the Spanish chronicles describe as a devastating epidemic. The symptoms described in the chronicles, fever, pustules, massive mortality, match those of smallpox, a disease that was endemic in Europe and Africa, but entirely absent from the Americas before 1492. Smallpox had arrived in the Caribbean with the Spanish in the early 16th century, and it spread with terrifying speed through indigenous populations that had no prior exposure and no immunity. It reached the mainland of Mesoamerica by the 1520s, where it contributed to the fall of the Aztec Empire. It seems to have reached the Andes shortly thereafter, possibly carried by indigenous traders moving along the coasts or through Panama, possibly even before any Spanish expedition had reached Peru. The epidemic that killed Huayna Capac, if it was indeed smallpox, was the first wave of a demographic catastrophe that would kill, by some estimates, as much as 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas over the next century. For the Inca Empire, the timing could not have been worse. Huayna Capac's death without a clear successor triggered a crisis. One son, Huáscar, was based in Cusco and claimed the throne on the grounds that he was born to the emperor's primary wife, the Coya, and that he had the support of the traditional nobility in the capital. Another son, Atahualpa, was based in Quito, where his father had spent his final years, and he had the support of the northern armies, the veterans of his father's campaigns. The two sides went to war. It was a brutal conflict, fought across the length of the empire, and it lasted for about 5 years, from roughly 1527 to 1532. Atahualpa's forces eventually won, defeating Huáscar's armies and capturing Huáscar himself. But the war had split the empire. It had destroyed the legitimacy of the central government. It had left entire regions devastated and depopulated, both by the fighting and by the ongoing epidemic. And it was into this fractured, traumatized empire that Pizarro and his men arrived in 1532. Pizarro landed on the northern coast of Peru in 1531 and spent several months moving south, gathering information about the political situation. By the time he reached Cajamarca, a city in the northern highlands where Atahualpa was encamped with a large army, Pizarro understood that the empire was divided and that many of the ethnic groups that the Incas had conquered resented Inca rule and might be willing to ally with the Spanish against Cusco. At Cajamarca, in November 1532, Pizarro invited Atahualpa to a meeting and then, in an act of astonishing audacity, ambushed him, killing thousands of his unarmed retainers and taking the emperor captive. Atahualpa, attempting to secure his release, offered to fill a room with gold and another with silver, a ransom that took months to gather and which the Spanish accepted. And then, after the ransom was paid, Pizarro had Atahualpa executed on charges of idolatry, polygamy, and the murder of his brother Huáscar. The execution of the emperor did not immediately end the empire. Pizarro installed a puppet ruler, a younger son of Huayna Capac named Manco Inca, and marched on Cusco, which fell in 1533 after a brief siege. But Manco Inca eventually rebelled, fleeing Cusco in 1536 and establishing a rump Inca state in the mountain refuge of Vilcabamba, where resistance continued until 1572, when the last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed by the Spanish. By that point, the demographic collapse was well underway. The combination of epidemic disease, warfare, forced labor in Spanish mines and estates, and the deliberate destruction of indigenous social and political structures had shattered the old order. The population of the Andes, which may have been as high as 14 million at the time of contact, had dropped to perhaps 2 million by the end of the 16th century. The great storehouses that had fed the empire were emptied or destroyed. The road system fell into disrepair. The quipus that had carried information across thousands of miles were confiscated and burned by priests who saw them as instruments of idolatry, and the knowledge of how to read them was lost within a few generations. The political unity of Tawantinsuyu was gone. What remained were the people, the millions of Quechua and Aymara and Mochica and Puquina speakers who survived the conquest and the epidemics, and who became the colonized subjects of the viceroyalty of Peru. Their labor extracted through systems like the mita, the forced labor draft that sent indigenous men to die by the thousands in the silver mines of Potosi. But survival, even in the face of such catastrophe, is its own form of resistance. The genetic and cultural legacy of the peoples who built and lived under the Inca Empire did not disappear. It persists today in the millions of people in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and neighboring countries who identify as indigenous, who speak Quechua or Aymara or one of the dozens of other indigenous languages that have survived into the present, and who maintain cultural practices and knowledge systems that trace back through the colonial period to the pre-contact world. Genetic studies of modern Andean populations show overwhelmingly indigenous ancestry, with relatively low levels of European or African admixture compared to many other parts of the Americas, particularly in rural highland communities. This is not to say that the colonial period did not leave a genetic mark. It did, particularly in urban areas and among populations that were subjected to Spanish colonization most intensively. But it is to say that the indigenous genetic heritage of the Andes has been remarkably resilient. When researchers analyze the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages of people who identify as Quechua or Aymara today, they find the same haplogroups that we see in ancient remains from the region, haplogroups A2, B2, C1 and D1 on the mitochondrial side, haplogroups Q and C on the Y chromosome side. These lineages connect modern Andean people not just to the Inca period, but to the much deeper history of human presence in South America, stretching back more than 15,000 years to the first migrations across Beringia and down through the ice-free corridors and along the coasts, all the way to the southern tip of Patagonia. The Inca Empire, for all its grandeur and its political sophistication, was a relatively recent chapter in that long story. What genetics helps us see is that the empire did not fundamentally alter the genetic landscape of the Andes. It reorganized it politically and culturally, but the people who built the terraces and walked the roads and wove the textiles were the same people, in a genetic sense, who had been living in those valleys and on those mountains for thousands of years before Pachacuti ever came to power. At the same time, and this is critically important, genetic data cannot and must not be used to dictate or constrain the identities of living people. The fact that modern Quechua speakers from different regions of the Andes show genetic differences that reflect their geographic origins does not mean that they are not Quechua. The fact that the Inca Empire was multi-ethnic does not diminish the reality that there is a shared Quechua identity today, one that is based on language, on shared history, on the experience of colonization and resistance, and on the choices that communities and individuals make about who they are. Genetics can show us structure and history. It can show us migrations and population continuity. It can, in some cases, help us understand the past in ways that would be impossible without it. But it cannot tell us who belongs where, or who has the right to claim a particular identity. That is a question that only the people themselves can answer. Indigenous identity in the Andes, as elsewhere, is defined not by DNA tests, but by community membership, by cultural participation, by language, by the transmission of knowledge and practice from one generation to the next. There are people today who have significant indigenous genetic ancestry, but who do not identify as indigenous, because they have been separated from those communities by generations of migration or cultural assimilation. There are people who have mixed ancestry, but who are recognized members of indigenous communities and who participate fully in those communities' cultural and political lives. Genetics is a tool. It is not a test of authenticity. And any attempt to use it as such, to draw bright lines around who is or is not truly indigenous based on DNA, is not only scientifically misguided, it is an echo of the same logic that colonial governments used to divide and control indigenous populations, the logic of blood quantum and racial categorization that has caused so much harm. So what, in the end, does the DNA of the Inca Empire reveal? It reveals an empire that was diverse from the beginning, built on the incorporation of distinct peoples rather than the expansion of a single ethnic group. It reveals a political system that was sophisticated enough to govern millions of people across one of the most challenging environments on Earth, without the benefit of writing as we know it, but with a deep understanding of how to move people and goods and information across vast distances. It reveals a population history that stretches back far beyond the Incas, to the initial peopling of South America and the thousands of years of cultural development that preceded the rise of Tawantinsuyu. It reveals resilience, the survival of genetic and cultural heritage through one of the worst demographic catastrophes in human history. And it reveals, perhaps most importantly, the limits of genetics itself. DNA can tell us a great deal about where people came from, about how populations are related, about the movements and mixtures that shape the human story. But it cannot tell us who people are in the present, what they mean when they claim an identity, or what their history means to them. That is work that belongs to the people themselves, work that is cultural and political and deeply personal, and that no scientific tool, no matter how powerful, can ever replace. As we close, I want you to think about what stood out to you from this story. Let me give you 6 specific pieces to consider. Number 1. The Ice Maiden Juanita, frozen for 500 years on Mount Ampato, whose hair and bones told us exactly where she came from and how far she traveled before she died. Number 2. The fact that the entire Inca Empire, 40,000 kilometers of roads and millions of subjects, was built in less than a century of explosive expansion. Number 3. The genetic evidence showing that the empire was multi-ethnic from the start, not a single people, but dozens of distinct groups held together by political control, not shared ancestry. Number 4. The isotopic data from capacocha victims showing that the Inca state could move children from distant provinces all the way to the summits of the highest mountains as part of a single ritual system. Number 5. The smallpox epidemic that killed the Emperor Huayna Capac and triggered a civil war, arriving in the Andes possibly before the Spanish themselves, setting the stage for Pizarro's conquest. Number 6. The survival of indigenous genetic and cultural heritage in the Andes today, carried by millions of Quechua and Aymara speakers whose ancestry connects them directly to the people who built Tawantinsuyu. Which of those 6 hit hardest for you? Drop the number in the comments. I want to know what resonated. If you have taken a DNA test and you are trying to make sense of what the percentages mean, what your haplogroups are telling you, why your results look different from your siblings, or where the limits of commercial ancestry testing actually are, I have put together a 24-page guide that walks through all of it. It is written with North American indigenous categories in mind, but the principles, how to read haplogroups, how admixture works, how DNA gets diluted across generations, apply no matter where your ancestry is from. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. Next time, we are leaving the Andes and going back across the water, but we are not going north. We are going to the Caribbean, to the people who met Columbus when he landed, the Taino, and to the question of what happened to them after contact, a story that is far more complicated than the narrative of extinction that has dominated for 500 years. Genetics has something to say about that too. I will see you in the next one.